All right, Jeremy, how'd it go?
From my perspective, it went well. Let's talk about feedback and how you did in terms of the three areas of the case.
hmm
And so first we'll talk about is how you set up your framework and took me through it.
hmm
From your perspective, how did it feel from your end?
Felt good. I always feel a little bit. I guess it's always a little bit less straightforward to me how to set up a case when there's a clear quantitative element, and then you kind of have to
hmm
like sprinkle or wrap around some of the more qualitative pieces. It's not just like,
hmm
hey, what are the four areas you need
hmm
to cover? Like this is clearly a case that's about opening a store, and you really need to be clear about the revenue drivers and the underlying cost of doing
hmm
so. And so that's going to be a side, like having done a number of these, like it's almost always going to have at least one substantive
hmm
piece of the case is going to focus on that. So that
Yeah.
struck me as like something to do. And then I think when we talk about like something like broad, like the market, I always try to be discreet about what we're actually
hmm
discussing as more qualitative factors. Something like competition, it can be qualitative at first, but ultimately it's going to be pretty substantial in terms of dictating your price point, whether you want to undercut your competition, whether you want to
hmm
match price. And then I think like team and capabilities is another kind of like semi fluffy category. But I think in general, something you should always mention, especially when you're like, hey, a friend is thinking about doing this, like that's nice. But if you think about your friends from home trying to do some stuff, like
mm
that can go really well or
Yeah.
really badly. So understanding whether they can do that is usually a key thing. But felt pretty straightforward framework
hmm
wise.
Yeah. I mean, from my end, it felt like you did a good job on it. This had all of the elements that I would look for as an interviewer. I think the two in this type of case where the main thing is opening a new store or launching a new business, can it
Yeah.
make money? And what's the market that we're launching in? If
hmm
those are there, then it's in one of those two buckets where the answer to the case most likely falls. So I'm happy you nailed both of those.
Got it. Cool. And it was clear the way like my style in terms of like how
Mhm.
I delivered the framework that made sense.
Yeah, the only thing you said, which is not a big piece of feedback, is you mentioned something about like segments or types of customers.
hmm
Um, Thinking back on it, I think there is a place for that type of breakdown, which is essentially like who's the customer. It's looking at the customer more closely, but I think you could have communicated a little bit more clearly to me about what you
hmm
were curious about from a customer standpoint.
Okay. Got it. Makes sense. Cool.
Cool. Should we move to the analysis parts of the case?
Yeah, that's it. So
Cool.
the math, market sizing first,
Sure. That the
or
market
yeah,
sizing, and we'll also talk about the break even calc, but sure, market sizing is good to start.
yeah. I think I always have a little bit more hesitancy, just like randomly sizing a market that I know
hmm
very little about. I think it's a natural feeling to be like feel like you're kind of in open water there.
Yeah.
I think in general, what's important to do and what I felt like I tried to do is like bringing you in on the calculation early, like
hmm
sense checking my numbers, but also just at least just getting some assumptions out there early. And if you get a
hmm
weird look from your interviewer, you have an idea that some number is really high, or maybe the
hmm
segments themselves are a little strange. And from my experience, like an interviewer will guide you a little bit in terms of what are the right segments. So like in this case, we went with like a low, medium, high. After I sort of like
hmm
probed you with a couple different segmentation options, I could kind of feel that you were leaning more towards that.
hmm
Um, in general, that's also I think a pretty high yield segmentation. Like
hmm
infrequent user, average user,
Yeah.
high frequency user. Like that's a
Right.
great way to segment a lot of the time. Um, I think I did a good job walking you through the math. Um,
hmm
the only time I felt less clarity was like with units and just like I think I even
hmm
misspoke once or twice. Something to always keep in mind is just like, especially when you're dealing with a lot of zeros and a variety of
hmm
segments and you have like 4 or 5 categories you're trying to multiply together, just not just being careful that with your numbers has felt like the hardest challenge there. And the math itself was super straightforward.
For sure. From my end, yeah, to start where you left off, the errors in the units, again, they're not a huge deal if they're one off, and I like that you kept your composure and it didn't turn into anything more than it was, and you still did a great job with the analysis, even though there were those errors. So just a note, like that's going to happen, and even from
hmm
my end, it's okay when it does. It's more about the reaction that you have back at it.
hmm
Um, I felt with the market size, I probably would have appreciated a little bit more if you were more like cavalier about it in a way, and just I appreciate the balance between checking in with the interviewer, giving options, and I also want to see that you're not afraid to just get after it. And so if I were in your shoes, I would have appreciated something more of like, this is how I want to do it. you mind if I get started? Or like,
Yeah.
do you agree that the right way is high, medium, low? I'm gonna get going. You know,
Hmm.
less
Hmm.
waiting for invitation. But I think in terms of the balance, you were in a near optimal place. I think it just could have been a little bit more towards the let's do it this way.
Got it. Got it. Um, I guess part of my last thought there is part of it is like when you're actually doing a real life sizing of a market and you're trying to figure out if a market is attractive. First off, these people throw out crazy numbers all the time, like, oh, like this segment of the AI market is $4 trillion. It's like, where the hell did you get those numbers, right?
Hmm.
And so I guess when I'm doing this, like I'm actually I'm trying to walk my interviewer through the intellectual
Yeah.
exercise of I'm actually going to weigh some segments. Like I don't know what
Yeah.
I didn't just come in here blessed with the right knowledge of how to exactly slice and dice a random market that
Hmm.
I've never thought about before. So that was my honest thinking, but that is helpful to just
Hmm.
like a little bit more bias to action. Um, in terms of break even, that felt
Hmm.
really easy. But perhaps
Yeah.
because I've done a number of break evens,
Yeah.
thoughts on like for maybe somebody who's like a little bit more
Hmm.
unfamiliar or just in general feedback on like how I walk through that part of the case.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it's clear you've done break even before. I don't have a lot of feedback on like the math. You nailed it. The simple formula for that, just so there's more of a framework around how Ben did this, is you're calculating something called contribution margin. That's basically the term for the cost minus the the COGS, the cost of goods sold. That's how Ben got the three. What we mean by contribution margin is that $3 are contributed to covering the costs every unit that's sold. And so then Ben knew that within that first year, $600,000 of costs had to get covered. The contribution margin towards that per unit was three. That's how you got to the 200K. Does that framework
Interesting.
make sense to you, Ben? That's how I'd.
It's interesting, and you referring to me in the third person. I mean, nothing gets me going like that, Jeremy. So I think I think from my perspective, it's just like how much can I sell this thing for? $5.
Yeah,
Awesome.
right.
How much does it take to get the thing into the store?
Yeah.
$2. Five minus two. That's my margin. That's how much I'm
Hmm.
making for every like widget unit that I sell of X good.
Yeah.
And then how many, like for breaking even, how many times do I have to repeat that process in order to cover the cost of setting up the business itself and running it? So you have, right, like your fixed, call it the fixed cost, and then your variable
Hmm.
costs. Like people always get these categories like for any basic economic analysis, but like I
Yeah.
have to put the thing in the ground, the store. It
Hmm.
exists now. Awesome. There was a cost associated with that, right? The capital expenditure, whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
real estate. Uh, then you have like, then it doesn't just stop there. Like I have ongoing costs that exist for the remaining duration of that year. Add those two buckets together and you have your total cost that you need to cover.
Yep.
And so $3 per cup at first seems like, man, we're gonna have to do a lot, but like
Mm.
doing that 200,000 times on repeat, once you have your process down, it's rather doable. Within a 12-month time frame, maybe tough. Which again gets to a little bit more of the call it the I think of this as like the real analysis, like
Hmm.
the second order analysis, which is so we gotten the math right, 200,000 cups of coffee to cover our costs, or keep on coffee cups of yogurt. uh, that is really simple, but I think a little bit more advanced, which is what we did in this case, which is like, what does that really look like on a day to day basis? And then
Mm.
using the what does it look like on a day to day basis? You know, in our case, like selling
Yeah.
something in the
Yeah.
order of 800 cups of
Yep.
yogurt a day. We can then look we can wrap our heads around that number. I can't
Yeah.
wrap my head around 200,000 cups a year. I don't know if that's realistic. But then breaking it down to a day to day level serves the purpose of being like, huh, that actually seems kind of high. And then we can go like, if it seems kind of high, is it realistic? And so that's when people talk about like sense check your
Yeah.
analysis. That is
Exactly.
using common sense to check whether or not this number is feasible. And if we
Hmm.
need to tweak any other assumptions, or if we need to straight up charge more, right? There are
Yeah.
options that then percolate out
Mm.
from the sense check. So that was my thought on the
Yeah.
rest of the break even because I don't want to forget about that part.
Oh, that was great that you did that. In other cases, for example, if we were sizing the t-shirt market in LA
Hmm.
and we had calculated that, and so this is back to market sizing, but a sense check example, if we calculated that there were like 800 billion shirts sold per year in LA, and we just divided that by the 4 million, we would see that that would require people are buying new shirts every 5 minutes. You know that's not the case.
Right.
So it's similar with this. If this number had told us we'd have to sell like 2 million cups a day, you would have instantly known that it's not feasible. And even with
Right.
what you calculated, it makes it much more tangible than, oh, this is the market size or this is how much we have to sell in a year.
Exactly. Okay, so that's the analysis piece.
Yep.
And then we kind of move to, well, I think the analysis would comprise the majority of the case in
Yep.
this in
That
a sense.
those two were the biggest pieces of analysis
Yeah.
that we did. The
And I think it's
debriefing.
worth saying as well, like I'm not sure in your experience necessarily, but in mine, like that doesn't necessarily always pan out in the same like fractional distribution of the case. Like in our
Mm,
case, the brainstorming part was a couple minutes, and then we sort of just dove into math.
hmm
Sometimes the brainstorming will be a large portion, and then the recommendation itself, usually the recommendation feels a little bit more like contained. It's
hmm
usually a 3 to 5 minute thing. But not even that necessarily sometimes. But I think in terms of the analysis itself, that was the majority. But let's move to the rec.
Yeah.
How did you think about that kind of the way I bifurcated the, what we had
hmm
done, and then some other considerations, and then the actual buckets that I chose.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. This I think was actually the strongest component of the case.
Hmm.
Even though all of them were strong. The reason that it was strong to me was because you went beyond the numbers that we calculated. So you gave your recommendation based on what you saw uh,
Hmm.
from the calculations, but then you extrapolated it out because you realized how much was missing from what we'd done. Like we had not considered at all the competition. We had not considered at all our branding. And if, you know, how do we know that people will go to a yogurt shop that they've never heard of? And how do we get to a point where they have? So I
Hmm.
like that you wrapped your recommendation not only with the calculations you made in the analysis part of the case, but also you went back to the framework. And I could see you especially drawing on that capabilities bucket that we never quite got into.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest black box was competition, and I think like that, and then just like, is this person actually gonna be able to execute this like
Yeah.
high level recommendation? Right, like first off, in a consulting capacity in real life, like uh, you want to really get as close to the end result as possible, in the sense that you don't want to just leave people with a recommendation they probably can't do. That's just you not doing your job and looking like you did your job, which is, I
hmm
think, first off, one of the problems with consulting at times as an industry, is they kind of have a set it and forget it mentality at times, and the worst the worst teams do that.
hmm
And so I think it's important that like whenever you're whenever you are recommending something, like put yourself in the mind of the shop owner. I think it's just
Yeah.
such an easier frame of mind, as opposed to like sitting there in a case being like, what are all the factors I need to consider as like a
Yeah.
brainstormy person? Just be like, all right, I'm about to open a shop. What does that look like?
Right.
Or invert it and be like, I'm a user.
hmm
I'm a buyer of yogurt. What would make
hmm
me go to this store and actually spend my money there? And I think
Yeah.
doing those two exercises, one over one, and then one over like X, and then one over X, in this
hmm
style, you can't help but include something like competition. Like, how could you not?
Yeah. For
Because if
sure.
you're the user, you're like, I'm hungry. I'm walking around, right? Like, I'm just a regular
Yeah.
person on the sidewalk. Like, am I going to
Yeah.
stumble into this Froyo shop? Do they have a great brand? Do I know what they are? Am I going to recommend
Right.
this thing to my friends? Right. So all those things can, I think, help you identify and uncover those round out parts of your framework.
Yeah.
So that's at
That
least the
is
tools I used.
very well said. Yep. It's great to just always bring this back to the idea that, like, at the end of the day, these interviewers, me in this situation, are asking ourselves the question, can I put this person in front of a client? And if I can't conclusively answer that yes, then we won't be able to, it's hard to see you fitting in at the firm. And so what we're looking for is an ability to put ourselves in the shoes of our friend opening the shop. Like what would she have to be able to do to open it? And
Right.
what would the people in LA have to believe to buy it?
Totally. And that's a perfect segue to like kind of the last part of our, our feedback section, which is just
hmm
around communication style, things that were done well that could have been better. Like, in terms of, now we're talking about like intangible stuff that isn't
hmm
the specific components of the case, but like, how was it delivered as an interviewer? Do you have initial thoughts on like how you received information and
hmm
how the dialogue went?
Yeah. I mean, I felt that it went smoothly and I appreciate
What parts went
the
smooth?
conversation.
What made it feel smooth?
Yeah, I appreciate the conversational nature of, let me take a step back. The thing I most appreciated actually was in the conclusion when you went beyond. as I mentioned, what we'd done, and started to make me feel like you were actually thinking critically about this business. Because a lot of times it's easy to move through cases and do the math and do what's asked, but that you're not actually thinking about it on a deeper level. And I got the sense that you actually are critically thinking about the question of should they open it and how do I know? And then how do I convince the interviewer that I have a good recommendation here? And you did that well. Um, the other part of the case that I found interesting was when I called you out for not called you out, but I dug into some of the math you'd done and I just
Hmm.
pressed making sure that it was right.
Hmm.
Uh, Again, I think a closed-minded interviewee would have shut that down or tried to defend the answer that they'd come up with without second checking it or second guessing it, whichever you want to call it. But I think you did those well. It showed like humility, ability to, understand that you're wrong and that at the end of the day, like that you're coachable as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And also like, yeah, I think the humility comes from like, remember that you don't know this stuff. At least
Hmm.
as you, at the very least, you don't know it as well as your interviewer in 99% of scenarios, unless you just so
Hmm.
happen to have built a company in the specific thing that they are trying to cover in this case. Like in that rare event, go ahead, lean into your knowledge. But other than that, like you almost always know less because they've often done this case in real life, or they are someone who's practiced this and seen 15 interviewees do the same thing and know what good looks like. Um, I'm trying to think of other pieces of this. In terms of the final recommendation, I think stylistically I made a couple choices
Hmm.
that are worth highlighting as we wrap this up. One is laser focus on the question, which you mentioned,
Hmm.
but just when a recommendation is made, it just by definition has to circle back to what is the thing we are trying to answer. And so every single piece of information that you bring in or that you include, don't just include it and say, we found break
Hmm.
even was X. What does that
Hmm.
mean? Why do I care? Like the so what is always critical to every component that you
Yeah.
bring in. And relating it back to the answer is that exercise. I also think like I think a couple of great questions to ask are just like, we have X information, and the information we have calculated or worked through so far leads you to believe a certain, like, you have 50% of the picture. And that 50% of the
Hmm.
picture has you leaning in one direction, in this case, to open the frozen yogurt shop. But acknowledging how substantial the buckets are that you don't know about, competition, the team's capabilities,
Hmm.
and that you truly need to dig into those and assess those, and that could literally reverse your decision, or further reinforce it. Like doing that and separating out what you do and don't know, I think is helpful for an interviewer, and sort of giving them a taste of like, what would you need to believe in order to go forward? What would stop you? Again, like that gets back to your point around critically thinking. And um, people might ask like, well, I can't critically think yet. Well, practice. Like if you keep practicing these cases, you will develop the option set of things to go through, and that help you round out this case. But those are just some final thoughts on like communication style and some discrete choices that were made that can hopefully help. Um,
Yeah.
any other like last thoughts?
I'm
All
wrapped
set.
up here.
All right, on to the next one.